Hey guys, I'm back. Today's video is the third part of my 3-part trilogy of sorts on the Ben 10 Classic series. Why is it 3 parts? Well, because I kinda suck at planning things out in advance. Anyways, in the first part of this trilogy, I talked briefly about the format of the Classic series. In the second part, I went more in-depth on all my favorite villains in the Classic series. And in today's part, I'm gonna talk about the Classic series finale, and how it encapsulates all the best parts of Classic. And I'm gonna talk about how the finale managed to address one of the popular criticisms of Ben 10 in a very smart and nuanced way. So now, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into the video.
Grandpa, what can we do next?
Get you to school, Ben. Summer's over.
Alright, I think it's time I address the elephant in the room here. A lot of Ben 10 fans and viewers seem to have a problem with Ben's character. I'm sure you've already heard the patented "Ben is super annoying and never learns his lesson" critique people are quick to throw at this series. Now, I've never really had a problem with this for a couple of different reasons. The first is that Ben still learns his lesson by the end of the episodes a lot of the times, and is usually punished for his arrogant behavior. So even if he does ultimately return to being arrogant by the next episode, it's not like the series is actively encouraging or romanticizing that kind of behavior, which is something even the sequel series struggled to do. I'm looking at you, Ultimate Alien. The second reason why I don't have a problem with Ben's character is because of the finale of the Classic series. See, in the finale of the Classic series, Ben acts a lot more mature than he does in the earlier episodes of the series. He goes from hating Gwen and constantly mocking her to kinda liking Gwen and playfully bantering with her a little bit. They seem to really get along for a little bit in this episode, and when she inevitably has to go home, Ben looks longingly at her while she leaves, which seems to suggest that he's actually sad to see his cousin go home, which is a far cry from how Ben initially felt towards Gwen at the beginning of this series. Ben also listens to Grandpa Max's advice for once in this episode, and refuses to reveal his abilities to anyone, even his own parents. And what's really sad about this is that, well, that's the only thing Ben really wants to do. Ben can't stand pretending to be a normal kid. Something that was already mentioned previously in other episodes of the Classic series has now become the focal point of this episode. Ben has no friends now and can't really talk about all the fun, wild adventures he had with his family. So he ends up kinda just becoming a loner, and it's honestly really sad seeing this formerly happy-go-lucky kid become so socially isolated due to this secret. It gets even worse when at one point Vilgax's drones invade the school looking for Ben, and Ben has to fight them as Diamond Head without revealing his identity. And after he de-transforms and is found by his classmates, they all think he ran away and hid from the drones like a coward, and he gets mocked and bullied for that, even though that's the exact opposite of what he was doing. And he can't tell them what he did, because for once in his life he's trying his best to listen to Grandpa Max, even though it goes against pretty much everything he wants. See, Ben wants to be a famous superhero, something he's literally said in previous episodes like I mentioned earlier. I mean, Ben has literally said the phrase, "If you're not a hero, you're a zero." And now, sadly, Ben has to pretend to be the zero, even though he wants to be the hero. All because he's being more responsible and listening to his grandfather. Something I honestly couldn't picture him doing in the earlier episodes of the Classic series. Now, yes, I know it's a very typical superhero trope for the superhero's alter ego to have a tougher life than the hero does, but I think it's used very well in this episode, mainly because all Ben wants is to be a famous, recognizable hero, whereas a character like Spider-Man kinda just doesn't want to be Spider-Man at all, and would probably be better off if he wasn't, and someone like Bruce Wayne is more or less just a mask to hide who he truly is. Ben, on the other hand, is just a normal kid who wants to be a hero, but can't, due to having to hide his true powers from everyone he knows and loves. And another reason why I think the trope is used better here in this episode compared to other superheroes that also use this trope is because of this scene from the finale.
Keeping a secret is never easy. Trust me. Every day I wanted to tell your grandma and our kids the truth.
Well, maybe if you had, you and Dad would get along better now.
You can't change the past, Ben.
This is probably my favorite thing from this finale, seeing the effects Max's lies had on both himself and Ben's dad. Their relationship is so strained that they practically feel like strangers towards one another when we see them interact with each other for the first time in this entire franchise earlier on in this episode. What's worse is that we see Ben slowly start to become distant from his father as well, due to this secret life he's being forced to live, all at the behest of Grandpa Max. It's only when Ben's secret is finally revealed by Vilgax that the Tennyson family seems to reunite and become a true family once more. I personally see this whole subplot as a kind of metaphor for growing up and becoming distant with one's family, and obviously learning how to reconnect again as adults. But that's probably just me overthinking things. Anyways, let's go back to Ben's character for a moment. This episode showcases a mature Ben that has indeed learned his lesson from the previous episodes and trusts Grandpa Max's advice, despite him really not wanting to. And this episode sees him and his cousin Gwen finally getting along with one another again. This, along with some of the Ben 10,000 episodes, show that eventually Ben will learn his lesson in the future, which is why it doesn't bother me as much when I go back and watch previous episodes of him being more arrogant and immature, because I know he won't always be like this. Plus, this episode is just a great ending to the classic series. Ben finally learns some humility and patience, and at the end of the episode is rewarded for this by being granted his dream of being a recognizable and respected superhero by his fellow classmates and even by his teachers, which is why it's one of my favorite episodes ever, and why I personally believe it to be the best Ben 10 finale. Yes, I know, everyone loves Alien Force Season 2's finale, but personally I prefer this more character-driven finale, and while I know people love the epic scale of the Omniverse finale, I don't mind this episode being a more low-key episode with just Vilgax being the main villain, especially because he did kinda start this whole franchise at the beginning, so it only makes sense that it ends with him being the final antagonist. Now, if you guys prefer Omniverse's finale or Alien Force Season 2's finale, or even, God forbid, Ultimate Aliens finale, that's cool. Contrary to what people might say in the comments, I'm not trying to tell you guys how to think, but I will say that this finale is my personal favorite in the entire franchise, and honestly, sometimes I'm fine to just let the series end here. I don't need to watch all the other Alien Force, Ultimate Alien, or even Omniverse episodes afterwards. I can just kinda pretend the series ended here, with the perfect finale. Now, I don't do this too often because I can't resist seeing Omniverse's malware arc and some of the great one-offs from Alien Force, but sometimes it is nice to think that this is where the show officially ends, because it's just such a perfect ending in my opinion. And on that note, let's move on to the next segment of this video, where I want to talk a little bit about my own personal feelings towards online criticism of both the classic Ben 10 series and other shows in general.
Well, just that Accelerate could have zipped off to that convention without Gwen or me ever realizing you were gone.
Oh, like you think you know everything.
Alright, this is the part of the video I've been dreading, mainly because I ended up making like 4 pages for this segment in the script and now I don't like any of them, and also because I know a lot of people have been asking me to respond to Ben 10 YouTuber critiques that have been coming out throughout the years, like Lower's video, for instance. I'm not gonna do that here just because I feel like that's gonna come across in a bad way, and because I feel like everyone is entitled to their opinion. Now that we've got that disclaimer out of the way, let's dive into the criticisms that I want to talk about. I'm only going to be talking about 3 major criticisms the show has received in order to keep this segment short, and those 3 criticisms are: 1. That the Ben 10 villains are all one-dimensional and want to take over the world, 2. That Ben's character is annoying, and 3. That Ben and Gwen arguing is very annoying and irritating. Now, yes, I know these aren't the only criticisms the show has received throughout the years, but they're the ones I want to focus on most, because all 3 of them are kind of reductive. For instance, the first criticisms, the villains are all one-dimensional and just want to take over the world. This criticism literally reduces down interesting villains like Vilgax to just their motivations. And the reason why I find that so annoying is because you can do that with pretty much any show or movie. I mean, take Thanos from Infinity War for example. I could just say, oh, Thanos is very one-dimensional and his motivation of wanting to have the Earth's population isn't really that compelling to me. 0 out of 10, try better, Marvel. Hopefully most of you can see why that's kind of irritating to me, because it misses the whole reason as to why these characters are the way they are, which is another aspect to all this that I want to briefly go over. See, a lot of critics nowadays seem to break down storytelling and writing to some kind of formula. Oh, make your villain have a more sympathetic motivation so the audiences can relate to him, and make your main character more likable by giving them a tougher life so us the audience can sympathize with them. Unless you want them to be inherently unrelatable and evil, in which case you need to go out of your way to showcase us their philosophy and why it's wrong. And then when you add X to Y and Z to S, you'll get a perfect story. Now, yes, I know this isn't every single critic on YouTube, and I know I exaggerated slightly at the end there, but it really does feel like a lot of these basic criticisms are being applied to every show or movie without people really thinking as to why the shows are like that in the first place. For example, the amount of times I've heard, oh, this guy just seems too one-dimensional, this villain needs to have a stronger motivation or more relatable backstory, is really starting to irritate me. Sometimes villains are made to seem irredeemable to showcase how in real life, certain people and groups and ideologies are inherently irredeemable, but a lot of times this context just seems to fly over people's heads. But what does any of that have to do with Ben 10? Well, quite a lot actually, because these three criticisms I mentioned earlier, the villains all wanting to take over the world, Ben's character being irritating to most critics, and Ben and Gwen's arguments being irritating to most critics, are all things that I personally love. I think these things are great. I love that a lot of villains just kinda wanna take over the world, because it makes every episode unique and engaging. Like I mentioned in the first part, none of them feel like a waste of time, because nearly every episode sees a guy trying to completely dominate the earth. Maybe for a character like Spider-Man I could see how this could eventually get annoying, because in Spider-Man's case it's more interesting to see his day-to-day life, but Ben 10's day-to-day life is trying to stop people from taking over the world. And just for the record, there are villains who don't exclusively want world domination, like the Road Crew, Rojo, and those Friends of Fish guys from the third episode of the classic series. While I won't deny that the vast majority of Ben 10 villains just want to take over the world, it still doesn't make this criticism exactly true. And again, I think it misses the reason as to why the show is like this. Remember, this was an episodic TV series airing in 2005. Every episode pretty much had to be a smash hit, or else Cartoon Network might decide to pull the plug. So naturally, the writers made a lot of the villains have these gigantically insane motivations to make these stories a kind of David versus Goliath epic, where Ben has to take on people who are just seemingly invincible and have such terrible plans for his world. So I think this criticism misses the mark a little bit. Again, if you feel that way, you're not wrong. I'm not trying to call anyone out here. I just personally can't agree and think that there's more interesting things about the villains. And similarly, I feel like people who say Ben is super annoying really don't get that Ben is supposed to be an arrogant child learning how to become a hero. He acts very childish and immature because he is a child. The writers wanted to realistically depict a 10-year-old, not have a 10-year-old Jesus who's already perfect gain immense power and learn to help people. That might work for other stories, but that's not what Ben 10 is trying to be. So I think it's unfair to criticize it for not being that when it was never trying to be. Again, I get that some of this criticism is just people getting annoyed at how drawn out Ben's character arc is, but I think these people are once again missing the why. Nobody knew if Ben 10 was gonna go past season 1, and once they did, they didn't really think about an ending, because you don't really think about endings for shows like this, at least not back in the day. Back in the day, you pretty much went as long as you possibly could in order to get a paycheck, and even after you were done and super annoyed with it, the network kept it going anyways, so they could get paychecks off of your hard work. So character arcs weren't as overt as they are now. Instead, you had smaller, subtler signs of change during certain episodes. And finally, the criticism as to why Ben and Gwen argue. This might be my hottest take ever on this channel, but honestly, I love Ben and Gwen arguing.
Are you crazy? Are you out of your mind? How could you say that?
Alright, calm down, people. Listen, I know it's an unpopular opinion, but it's just honestly how I feel. Ben and Gwen arguing reveals so much about their characters, and it's all showing and no telling. The one I always go back to, for an example, is when Ben and Gwen are arguing about their birthday parties, and we see that Gwen has already planned hers out well in advance, whereas Ben is still waiting to plan his out till it gets to the day of. Immediately, you can tell that one of these characters plans things out in advance and is very meticulous, whereas the other is a very go-with-the-flow kind of casual person. Without having seen any other episode of the show, you immediately get a sense of their characters. I think that kind of managed to tackle the why I like it and why it is the way it is. So now I'm going to transition into one last topic before we move on. Now again, I understand everything I said here is very subjective, but again, even if you do agree with these criticisms, I feel like you're not fully understanding the why. I was going to bring this up in the first part of this trilogy, but since I've already mentioned it a little bit here, I just want to point out that in 2005, TV was very, very different to what we have today, and judging the Ben 10 series by modern standards is doing it a disservice. Judging any form of art by that kind of metric is kind of a disservice. Like for instance, watching the Indiana Jones movies and wondering, hey, how come these movies don't really flow into each other like the Marvel movies? Well, it's because they were meant to be standalone experiences, each and every one, that anyone could watch even if they never heard of Indiana Jones before. How come Indy doesn't have that much character development? Well, because his character development is more subtle, so his character is never too different for newcomers, so that way they can get a good sense of him. And by the end, we do see a development. He's a much different man now and is able to stand up to his father in a way he probably couldn't in the previous movies because of that development he received. It's sort of the same thing going on here in Ben 10. Ben probably wouldn't have acted the way he did in the finale if he hadn't gone through the experiences he had in the previous episodes. Anyway guys, I think I've rambled on enough in this segment, so let's move on to the final segment of this video, shall we? Alright, so I've never really talked about art style or animation stuff on this channel before because I'm not really that knowledgeable on those things, but a big part of why I love the original series even more than some of its successors is due to its incredible visual design, so I felt like I at least had to mention it briefly here at the end. Everything from the original series art style to its cleverly unique transformation sequences is spectacularly done, and its bombastic action sequences always leave me in awe. The transformation sequences specifically are just incredible, and I'm honestly sad that they mostly get replaced by a static green effect in some of the later shows, because they always manage to get my blood pumping as a kid with how cool they look. The art style also manages to find a nice blend between cartoony yet slightly real looking, and like I mentioned earlier, the action sequences are spectacular. They always seem to be perfectly directed in a way that helps really highlight the impact of the punches and the speed of the fights, as well as just the sheer scope of what's happening. Like I said, I'm really not the most knowledgeable person on animation or art style, but I feel like this is just such a big part of why I love this show that I couldn't leave it out. And that about wraps up this trilogy of videos on the classic series. But don't worry, dear viewer, in my next video I plan to talk about Ben 10 Omniverse for the first time ever on this channel, well besides those Rooters Arc videos. So if you're interested in that, please consider subscribing so you can see that video when it gets uploaded. And please like and share this video if you agreed with some of my points, and if you disagreed, let me know why in the comment section below. That's all for this video. See you guys next time on the Omniverse video.